Henry Lawson was an Australian writer and bush poet. Along with his contemporary Banjo Paterson, Lawson is among the best known Australian poets and fiction writers of the colonial period and is often called Australia's greatest short story writer. A vocal nationalist and Republican, Lawson regularly contributed to the Bulletin, and many of his works helped popularize the Australian vernacular in fiction. He wrote prolifically into the 1890s, after which his output declined, in part due to struggles with alcoholism and mental illness. At times destitute, he spent periods in Darlinghurst jail and psychiatric institutions. After he died in 1922, following a cerebral hemorrhage, Lawson became the first Australian writer to be granted a state funeral. He was the son of the poet, publisher, and feminist Louisa Lawson. He was born in South New Wales, which was called Pipe Clay when his parents met during the gold rush. His mother was the poet and feminist Louisa Lawson. His father, a miner, was born in Norway. Due to chronic infections, Henry became completely deaf, relying on reading to complete his education. He particularly enjoyed the works of Charles Dickens, Frederick Marryat, and Bret Harte. Lawson's first poem, A Song of the Republic, was published in 1887. His most successful collection was published in 1896, titled While the Billy Boils, which is credited with reinventing Australian realism in its raw and sharp style. Lawson wrote extensively about the Australian outback, though he spent most of his life in its cities. In his advancing years, Lawson became increasingly withdrawn, depressed, and poor, yet he remains one of Australia's greatest short story writers, along with contemporary author Banjo Paterson. Lawson's most successful prose collection is While the Billy Boils, published in 1896. In it, he continued his assault on Paterson and the Romantics, and in the process virtually reinvented Australian realism. Elder writes that he used short, sharp sentences with language as raw as Ernest Hemingway or Raymond Carver. With sparse adjectives and honed to the bone description, Lawson created a style and defined Australians dryly laconic, passionately egalitarian, and deeply humane. Most of his work focuses on the Australian bush, such as the desolate past Karen, and is considered by some to be among the first accurate descriptions of Australian life as it was at the time. The Drover's Wife, with its heartbreaking depiction of bleakness and loneliness, is regarded as one of his finest short stories. It is regularly studied in schools and has often been adapted for film and theatre. Like the majority of Australians, Lawson lived in a city which had had plenty of experience in outback life. In fact, many of his stories reflected his experiences in real life. In Sydney, in 1898, he was a prominent member of the Dawn and Dusk Club, a bohemian club of writer friends who met for drinks and conversation. In 1903, he bought a room at Mrs. Isabel Byers' Coffee Palace in North Sydney. This marked the beginning of a 20-year friendship between Mrs. Byers and Lawson. Despite his position as the most celebrated Australian writer of the time, Lawson was deeply depressed and perpetually poor. He lacked money due to unfortunate royalty deals with publishers. His ex-wife repeatedly reported him for non-payment of child maintenance, resulting in jail terms. He was jailed at Darlinghurst Jail for drunkenness, wife desertion, child desertion, and non-payment of child support 7 times between 1905 and 1909 for a total of 159 days and recorded his experience in the haunting poem 103, his prison number, which was published in 1908. He refers to the prison as Starvinghurst Jail because of the meager rations given to the inmates. At this time, Lawson became withdrawn, alcoholic, and unable to carry on the usual routine of life. Mrs. Byers was an excellent poet herself, and although of modest education, had been writing vivid poetry since her teens in a similar style to Lawson's. Long separated from her husband and elderly, Mrs. Byers was, at the time she met Lawson, a woman of independent means, looking forward to retirement. Byers regarded Lawson as Australia's greatest living poet and hoped to sustain him well enough to keep him writing. She negotiated on his behalf with publishers, helped to arrange contact with his children, contacted friends and supporters to help him financially, and assisted and nursed him through his mental and alcohol problems. She wrote countless letters on his behalf and knocked on any doors that could provide Henry with financial assistance or a publishing deal. It was in Mrs. Isabel Byers' home that Henry Lawson died of cerebral hemorrhage in Abbotsford, Sydney in 1922. He was given a state funeral. His funeral was attended by the Prime Minister Billy Hughes and the later Premier of New South Wales, Jack Lang, who was the husband of Lawson's sister-in-law, Hilda Brett, as well as thousands of citizens. He is interred at Waverley Cemetery. Lawson was the first person to be granted a New South Wales state funeral, traditionally reserved for governors, chief justices, etc., on the grounds of having been a distinguished citizen.